It began as a quarrel about money and worship in a kingdom that had only recently learned to call itself British. By 1642, that quarrel had become something else, not merely king against parliament, but three interwoven wars across three crowns: England's pitched fields, Scotland's kirk politics, and Ireland's embattled countryside. The conventional image, a royal standard flying against a parliamentary banner, captures the drama, but it occludes the mechanisms and theaters that actually decided the fate of the Stuart monarchy. This is the untold story, how legal technicalities, fiscal expedients, and conflicts in Scotland and Ireland created a centrifugal pressure that tore the British world apart. If you want a series that digs beyond the scaffold and the single courtroom drama, subscribe now and follow the maps. What follows will track not only armies, but accounts, proclamations, and the petitions that transformed lived grievance into armed revolution. To understand why England unraveled, we must begin with the premise on which Stuart kings governed. James VI of Scotland succeeded to the English throne in 1603. As James I, he carried with him a belief that would inform his son and inflame his subjects. Monarchy was not merely political office, but a divinely ordained hierarchy. The doctrine of the divine right of kings placed royal will above much human contestation. Kingship, in this view, was a sacred trust and an engine for uniformity. Yet belief does not pay soldiers or repair harbors. The early Stuart reigns tested the limits of theology against the arithmetic of revenue. By the 1620s, the crown's finances were in chronic trouble. War, patronage, and an increasingly complex web of royal expenditures had driven the monarchy to improvise new forms of income. Parliament, while willing to provide subsidies for war, balked at open-ended subsidies and at the use of taxation to underwrite what MPs saw as royal extravagance. The resulting standoffs produced creative and legally dubious fiscal instruments. Tonnage and poundage, a long-standing duty on shipping, had customarily been granted to a new king for life. Parliament refused to confirm it unconditionally to Charles I. In response, the crown turned to forced loans, monopolies awarded to favorites, and the infamous extension of ship money, a medieval coastal levy reimagined as a national tax and, crucially, levied without parliamentary consent. Ship money came to symbolize the larger problem. If the law could be stretched to permit extraordinary revenue raising in peacetime, what would stop the crown from turning emergency measures into permanent authority? Opponents argued that if a king could extract money without parliament, the constitutional balance would erode. The king's need for cash would convert his prerogative into raw power. Supporters claimed necessity.
Historians still debate the crown's motives. Some emphasize fiscal desperation and administrative innovation. Others point to a will to centralize governance without parliamentary interference. The legal fight over ship money culminated in the career-defining protest of John Hampden, whose refusal to pay and subsequent trial in 1637 became a cause célèbre. The judges who upheld the crown's right to levy the tax did so by narrow majorities. Their verdict satisfied neither subject nor sovereign. As contemporary pamphleteers put it, the law stood fractured like a cracked mirror reflecting both legitimacy and grievance. Grievance found political form in a document that remains central to the constitutional argument of the 17th century, the Petition of Right of 1628. Presented by Parliament to Charles, it insisted that certain old liberties not be treated as malleable by royal prerogative. It declared that the crown ought not to imprison men arbitrarily, levy taxes without parliamentary consent, billet soldiers among civilians, or impose martial law in peacetime. Its language, insisting on no freeman be compelled to make or yield any gift, loan, benevolence, tax, or such like charge without common consent in Parliament, was less a blueprint for revolution than an appeal to precedent, a demand that the king administer his power within inherited limits. Charles accepted the petition under pressure, but acceptance did not translate into affection for constraint. The legal contradiction hardened. Instruments of statecraft continued to be employed in ways that Parliament insisted were unlawful. The Crown insisted they were necessary. Religious conflict fused with fiscal dispute to produce a combustible mix. Charles's marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, was politically expedient but culturally inflammatory in a Protestant nation where worship, ritual, and clerical office were already battlegrounds. More decisive was the Anglican axis of influence embodied by William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1633. Laud's project emphasized ceremonial uniformity, episcopal authority, and a sacramental focus that many Puritans read as a recrudescence of popish tendencies. Laud sought to order worship and discipline the clergy, a program that in practice meant silencing alternative expressions of Protestant dissent and imposing a tighter liturgical script across parishes.
This enforcement of conformity provoked more than theological disputation. It threatened local communities whose identities had coalesced around distinctive forms of worship and governance. For many Puritans and Presbyterians, the matter was existential. An episcopal, ceremonially oriented Church of England implied not only doctrinal retrogression, but political centralization. Opposition coalesced in pamphlets, petitions, and the persistent parliamentary complaints about Labian innovations.
The rhetoric hardened from appeals to reform into assertions that certain royal advisers, Laud included, had turned the crown toward arbitrary rule. Meanwhile, across the border in Scotland, Laudian reforms were received as an invasion of the Kirk. The Scottish church governance was Presbyterian, and the attempt to impose Anglican forms provoked a decisive counter-movement. In 1638, Scottish landowners, clergy, and lairds assembled the National Covenant, pledging to maintain the true religion and reject innovations imposed without consent. The covenant was both spiritual declaration and political compact. It bound signatories by oath to resist changes that threatened what they understood as the covenantal relationship between God and the nation. When Charles pressed forward with a new Scottish prayer book in 1637, scenes of popular resistance, the famous incident at St. Giles in Edinburgh, where a woman reputedly hurled a stool at the officiating minister, signaled that parish-level opposition could scale quickly into political crisis. The consequence was immediate and destabilizing. The Bishops' Wars of 1639–1640 pitted Scottish Covenanting forces against royal armies, and they did so not as minor border skirmishes, but as decisive tests of the king's ability to project force. Charles's attempt to subdue Scotland failed, in part because his treasury could not underwrite a protracted campaign. The failure forced him back to the one institution that, at least on paper, could grant the resources he needed, the English Parliament. What the king sought to avoid, a reckoning with his realm's representatives, became unavoidable. If Scotland had forced Charles to call parliaments again, Ireland soon made the return fraught with a new and bloodier dimension. In October 1641, a rising broke out in Ulster and parts of the Irish Midlands. The causes were manifold: dispossession, plantation policies that had transplanted Protestant settlers into lands formerly held by Gaelic lords, economic hardship, and rumors that English Protestants planned to suppress Catholicism violently. The rising quickly degenerated into local atrocities on both sides. Protestant settlers and Catholic insurgents each suffered and each committed reprisals. Contemporaries in England received reports in a fever of alarm. Claims of mass murder and forced conversions circulated widely. Some accounts were careless, others deliberate propaganda, but the core fact was that Ireland had become a locus of violence whose scale and sectarian tenor could not be contained by English political debate. The Irish troubles provided a new rationale for military mobilization and hardened attitudes in London. To many, Ireland represented both a security threat and a moral crisis. Parliament's response in the early 1640s was shaped by these overlapping crises. A mix of legal protest and political maneuvering produced a series of documents and debates that would make the king's position untenable.
The Grand Remonstrance of November 1641, a sweeping catalogue of grievances presented by Parliament, did not seize power directly, but it nationalized the case against the Crown in moral and historical terms. It accused certain royal ministers of corruption and plotted a course for reform that would limit the scope of unchecked prerogative. Its publication polarized opinion. To royalists, it was an affront and an incitement. To reformers, it was a handsome manifesto of necessity. At the heart of parliamentary resistance stood a cohort of articulators and organizers, men like John Pym, whose skill lay in marshalling parliamentary procedure, brokering alliances, and framing grievance in constitutional language. Pym's speeches and committee work turned disparate local complaints into a coherent parliamentary program. Alongside him stood jurists and local gentry, men like Sir Edward Coke in memory, if not in person, and active resistors like John Hampden, who gave legal teeth and public drama to the opposition. They did not uniformly seek the overthrow of monarchy. Rather, many aimed to secure a government limited by law and consent. Yet the drift from protest to armed readiness was progressive. Once armed forces began to assemble under various authorities, the question of legal constraint shifted toward the question of who could command legitimacy by force. Charles's missteps catalyzed what followed. Distrust grew acute when the king attempted to arrest 5 members of the House of Commons in January 1642, a breach of parliamentary privilege that many in London understood as an assault on the body politic itself. The gesture was both a miscalculation and a revelation. Whether or not Charles intended to provoke war, the episode made it plain to many MPs and their supporters that the king was ready to employ coercion against political opponents. For others, it confirmed earlier fears about arbitrary government.
Once the king and parliament moved beyond rhetorical contest and toward military mobilization, institutional ambiguities produced paradoxical rivalries. Parliament claimed the authority to raise militia by ordinance. The king asserted prerogative through the commission of array. Localities found themselves torn between decrees and obligations, and the patchwork of oaths and loyalties that defined early modern Britain became a mosaic of competing obligations. More prosaically, but more decisively, both sides scrambled for money, weapons, and men. Mobilization was uneven, shaped by regional identities, economic capacities, and the personal networks of local elites. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a cast of figures whose decisions would magnify the conflict. Charles I remained the pivot, a man committed to his conscience and the dignity of kingship, but increasingly isolated by the politics of his court and the operations of fiscal arithmetic.
Queen Henrietta Maria, a Catholic and a foreign princess, became both a political actor and a symbol. Her presence confirmed English anxieties about Catholic influence. Militarily, Prince Rupert of the Rhine emerged as the king's most conspicuous commander, audacious, charismatic, and a cavalryman famed for shock attack and decisive charges. His nephew's brilliance on horseback won battles, but also exposed faults. A cavalry that won on elan sometimes failed where sustained logistics and disciplined reserves mattered. On the parliamentary side, figures such as the Earl of Essex, appointed Captain General early in the war, embodied caution and aristocratic command. His caution often chafed with those who sought more radical measures. Rising from relative obscurity, Oliver Cromwell, a country gentleman with a deep Puritan conscience, began to show a different kind of military and political talent. Disciplined cavalry formations that would later be called Ironsides, a sternness toward indiscipline, and a willingness to bind military action to political purpose. Cromwell's combining of religious conviction and military professionalism would become decisive as the war evolved, but in 1642-1643, his trajectory was still a contingent possibility among many. The opening campaigns were as unsettled as the politics that produced them. When the king raised his standard at Nottingham on 22 August 1642, he declared personal resolve. That gesture, iconic in later memory, was only the beginning of a season of maneuvers that would test who could translate authority into sustained command. The first pitched encounter at Edgehill on 23 October 1642 was not the climactic clash many later narratives assigned to it. Instead, it was a bloody and inconclusive engagement in which both sides learned tactical lessons and both discovered that noble elan could not substitute for supply and coordination. Casualty estimates vary, contemporary accounts differ, but on the field perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 men lay dead or wounded on each side, enough to render the battle costly but not decisive. Edgehill exposed several structural problems. Royalist cavalry, led by Prince Rupert, displayed shock power that could break parliamentary lines in local fights, yet absence of a coherent, unified strategy beyond passing tactical success meant that resounding opportunities for pursuit were missed. Parliament's forces, improvised and locally raised, often lacked cavalry punch but sometimes displayed tenacity in defense. The strategic prize was London. Whoever could control the capital and its resources would hold the initiative. Prince Rupert's march toward the city was checked at Turnham Green on 13 November 1642 by a sizable parliamentary force that refused to yield the suburbs. The result was a royal retreat toward Oxford, where Charles established a makeshift royal capital and moderation of his military aims toward regional consolidation.
Over the winter and into 1643, the war's geography became more regionally differentiated. Royalists consolidated in the West Country and the Southwest, where local gentry such as Sir Ralph Hopton rallied to the king and fought to preserve traditional socio-religious orders. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle marshaled a strong royalist presence centered on Yorkshire, drawing support from landholders threatened by Parliament's ascendance in London. Parliament's strength lay in the southeast and in the more economically dynamic boroughs that could supply money, ports, and manpower. These regional polarities produced a war that was at once national in narrative and local in execution. Sieges, skirmishes, and small-scale maneuver often mattered more to parishioners and wheat prices than to grand strategy. Allied to the military shifts were political calculations that reached outward into Scotland. The Scottish Covenanters, alarmed by the king's religious policies and by the prospect of an allied royalist consolidation, approached Parliament with a bargain. In 1643, the Solemn League and Covenant bound Scottish Presbyterian forces to parliamentary aims in exchange for promises of ecclesiastical settlement and the defense of the Reformed religion.
Its language committed signatories to preserve the Reformed religion in the Church of Scotland and to endeavour to bring the churches of God in England into the nearest conjunction and uniformity. This was political diplomacy dressed as confessional covenant. The Scotch decision to intervene changed the war's balance. It added a disciplined army to parliamentary resources and transformed regional reverses into strategic pressure on royalist strongholds in the north and west. For royalists, the Covenanter Agreement was not merely a military complication but a constitutional threat. It suggested that Parliament, not merely in rhetoric but in force, reshaped the religious settlement of the realm. For many in England, the idea of importing Scottish religion into English parishes was alarming. For Scots, the bargain offered a chance to secure their kirk and to exert influence south of the border. The settlement, moreover, had ramifications in Ireland, where the prospect of a Parliament Scotland axis altered calculations for Irish Confederates, Royalist sympathisers and English settlers alike. By the close of 1643, the war had become braided with diplomacy, legal contest, and cross-border alliances. Small-scale catastrophes accrued, sieges that devastated towns, mercenary-style marauding that depopulated regions, and local courts that dispensed punishment in ways that hardened social cleavages. Ordinary people, parishioners, tenants, and merchants found their lives caught between requisitions and reprisal.
In Ireland, the rising persisted as a brutal counterpoint. Estimates of deaths and displacement vary widely, with contemporary accounts and modern historians offering ranges that reflect both incomplete records and political agendas. Where numbers cannot be precise, the pattern is clear. The Irish experience was one of dispossession, violence, and long-term demographic upheaval, a consequence that would reverberate for generations and that contemporary English politicians increasingly used to justify harsh measures. As 1644 opened, the conflict had already exceeded simple binaries. The king had not been overthrown. Parliament had not yet seized an unambiguous victory. Instead, the contest had turned three crowns against one another in a dance of alliances, legal argument, and battlefield improvisation. The untold elements, legal instruments like ship money and the Petition of Right, the Scottish covenantal bargain, and the Irish spiral of violence, had transformed a domestic quarrel into a transnational crisis that tested the limits of early modern sovereignty. Yet beneath the political and confessional language lay another transformation in the making, the mechanization of armed authority. England's field armies were still largely feudal in origin, levies raised by peerage networks and commanded according to social rank. But new forms of military organization were already being proposed that would alter civil power's shape long after banners were furled. Men like Cromwell argued that discipline, training, and a professional ethic could produce an army loyal to a political cause rather than merely to a magnate's purse. Others feared precisely that shift. A professionally trained, politically assertive army might itself become an instrument of rule, independent of Parliament and king alike. The paradox of the 1640s is that efforts to contain power through law and consent might lead to instruments, armies, and administrative mechanisms capable of transcending or subverting those limits. So by spring 1644, the war faced a hinge. Regions had been drawn into lines of supply and expectation. Scotland's covenantal army stood ready to coordinate with Parliament. Irish violence hardened resolve and provided casus belli for reprisals. Royalist ambitions were constrained by finances and by the practicalities of sustaining a campaign across contested terrain. Commanders sharpened reputations. Prince Rupert's cavalry would remain feared and admired. The Earl of Newcastle's northern strength seemed formidable. Sir Thomas Fairfax and a rising Cromwell would soon show how discipline could replace bravado as the decisive quality of command. The next season would bring pitched battles that reframed the war's scale and meaning.
But even as muskets and pikes were cast into the national reckoning, the deeper argument continued in petitions, proclamations, and courts. Who could lawfully tax? Who could lawfully command? And who would speak for the realm when law itself was in contest? Those questions, legal, fiscal, and confessional, were not abstract. They were the scaffold upon which men would either build a new polity or raise the old. When the first cannon smoke cleared at Edgehill, both sides believed they had been tested. Neither had been broken. Yet the structures that had permitted royal authority, revenue without consent, ecclesiastical uniformity imposed from above, and the king's personal networks of patronage were fracturing. Parliament, for its part, was organizing itself into a political and military apparatus that extended beyond Westminster into counties and ports. The war had left the realm exhausted, and exhaustion breeds innovation as much as despair. Finance would be rewritten, religious compromise would be sought and rebuffed, military methods would be debated and reformed.
The conflict was no longer merely English, it was a three-kingdom convulsion whose ultimate settlement would require reckoning across Ireland, Scotland, and England alike. The story had reached its first long pause, a country mobilized, parliaments radicalized, kings isolated, and three theaters, each with its own logic and suffering, moving into alignment for a conflict that would test the very meaning of sovereignty. The coming chapters would make that alignment decisive. They would show how the new model army emerged from experiments in discipline and organization, how the Scottish alliance reshaped strategic options, how Ireland's devastation was both weapon and motive, and how constitutional language, petitions, remonstrances, oaths, became the grammar of revolution. What began as a quarrel about taxes and ritual was fast becoming a remaking of British political life. The spring and summer of 1644 unfolded like the tightening of a vice. Where earlier seasons had been made of raids, sieges, and uncertain maneuvers, this one produced battles whose outcomes would set the political map for years to come. Two events in particular, Marston Moor and the creation and baptism by fire of the new model army, recast the strategic possibilities for both crowns and commonwealths. The narratives that follow are tactical stories and political ones, how decisions on a ridge or a riverbank map directly onto the constitutional future of three kingdoms. Marston Moor, July 2, 1644, takes shape on a late summer plateau outside York. The city, Charles's principal northern bulwark, sits astride a logistic axis. To dislodge royal power in the north would be to strip the king of one of his most reliable resource bases. The Earl of Newcastle, commanding a large royalist army estimated at 20,000 to 24,000 men, holds it with a mix of veteran cavalry, county levies, and local horse.
Across the Ouse and the Vale, a parliamentary and covenanter coalition, under the Earl of Manchester, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and the Scottish commander Alexander Leslie, converges with perhaps 26,000, 28,000 infantry and horse. Numbers vary in contemporary accounts and modern reconstructions. Scholars give ranges because muster rolls and returns are imperfect. But the broad fact is clear. At Marston Moor, the northern contest will resolve whether the king retains strategic mobility in England's north. Terrain matters. The battlefield is a patchwork of ridges and low-lying marshes, with the Marston Ridge forming the key high ground. Rupert commands the royal left, Goring and Hotham hold the center, Byron and Langdale occupy the right. Prince Rupert's cavalry, shock troops of remarkable elan, are poised to deliver the kind of crushing charge that had decided local actions before. On the parliamentarian side, Oliver Cromwell's cavalry, the Eastern Association's Ironsides, are ready to test their new discipline against Rupert's glamour. The battle opens with a royalist assault to relieve York. Rupert, as ever, leads a thunderous cavalry attack and sweeps aside the parliamentary left in a series of charges that carry his troopers into the enemy's rear. But strategic cohesion is lacking. Newcastle's foot, called upon to exploit local gains, falters. Lancashire militias and royalist infantry do not coordinate enough to convert Rupert's success into a strategic victory. Cromwell's troopers, by contrast, display an emerging doctrinal difference: controlled charges, rapid reformation, and refusal to pursue into disorder. When Cromwell counterattacks, Rupert finds himself checked by disciplined resistance rather than a rout. On the right, the battle's decisive contest unfolds in a different register. The Scots, advancing under Leslie and commanded tactically by Lord Leven, bear down on the royalist right under the command of Langdale and Byron. Here, disciplined musketry and well-placed cavalry combine. The royalist center, already stretched by the pressure of Essex and Fairfax attacks, breaks under weight both numerical and logistic. By nightfall, the royalists are in full retreat. York falls in the campaign's aftermath, and the north is lost to the king for the foreseeable future. Marston Moor demonstrates several themes. First, the Covenanter presence rewrites the war's arithmetic. The Scots bring not only men, but an organizational culture and a stake in religious settlement that reshapes the political bargains at Westminster. Second, tactical discipline is beginning to trump dashing courage. The quality of cohesion, drill, and command and control matters more than the brilliance of a cavalry charge. And third, the loss of the North severs a major revenue stream and territorial base for Charles, intensifying the fiscal squeeze that already animated its political crisis. The aftermath of 1644 produces two immediate reactions in Westminster and Oxford.
Parliament grows more confident that the king can be contained. Its coalition with Scotland, though fraught and often morally uncomfortable, appears militarily useful. Royalists, by contrast, question their strategy. To rely on cavalry and noble elan is to court tactical success without strategic sustainability. The question that preoccupied reformers in Parliament becomes institutional as much as military. Can the parliamentary war effort be turned from a mosaic of regional forces into a coherent national instrument? The answer will be the new model army. Debates in Parliament during 1644-1645 over military reform are as political as they are pragmatic. Many MPs are suspicious of a standing, centrally controlled army. Others, especially soldiers and radicals, insist that without professional, nationally accountable forces, Parliament cannot secure victory. The army ordinance debates expose deeper anxieties. Who will command and under what political terms? Should officers be appointed by election of the men, by parliamentary commission, or by patronage? The compromise that emerges in April 1645, creating a force centrally raised, professionally administered, and purged of incompetent or partisan officers, will have consequences far beyond the pitched field. The new model army is organized on principles that reflect lessons learned in earlier campaigns. It emphasizes permanent regiments, standardized pay, central provisioning, clear promotion by merit, and a unified command under Sir Thomas Fairfax as general and Oliver Cromwell as his lieutenant general of horse. Its officer corps includes a mix of gentry, experienced captains, and zealous Puritans whose religious commitments bind unit morale. Men are drilled to hold lines, to coordinate musket and pike, and to execute cavalry shocks in support of infantry formations. The Army's administrative innovations, payrolls, victualling contracts, centralized ordnance, transform the way military power is projected in Britain. The test comes quickly at Naseby, 14 June 1645, where the king, trying to relieve pressure in the west and link up with Hopton, finds his army intercepted east of Oxford by Fairfax's new model. The Royalist force, perhaps 14,000, 16,000 strong, crosses the fields near Naseby to the north of a stream and on ground that offers only limited maneuver room. Fairfax, with about 12,000, 14,000 men, positions his infantry in the center and his horse on the flanks. Cromwell commands the right-wing cavalry. King's left is under Rupert. Naseby begins as a tactical duel. Rupert's cavalry on the royal left performs as he always does, charging hard and fast, breaking into Parliament's lines and pursuing fugitives. But the parliamentary center, composed of solid long-range musketeers and pikemen who hold their ground, and the controlled counter by Cromwell on the right, turned that initial success into disaster.
When Rupert sweeps off the field in pursuit of plunder and the enemy artillery, the royal center is left exposed. Fairfax orders a coordinated counterattack. Infantry pushes forward, Cromwell returns to the fight and exploits the fractured royal army. The king's cavalry cannot reconstitute a protective screen, and royal infantry collapses. The day ends with the capture of the king's personal correspondence, documents later read in Parliament that reveal Charles's attempts to raise foreign assistance and to negotiate separate peace terms. Strategically, Naseby amounts to a kill shot. Royal field armies are shattered, the king's capacity to wage national war is exhausted. Casualty and capture figures at Naseby are contested. Estimates suggest royal losses of several thousand men killed, wounded, or captured, while parliamentary losses are lower but still significant. The important fact is not a single number, but the qualitative shift. The king can no longer conduct an offensive campaign on the scale required to win the war. Once again, the three-kingdom dynamic intervenes. Irish levies and Scottish politics will still matter, but the main field contest in England has been decided. From militarily decisive to politically decisive is not an immediate, inevitable transition. The period 1646 to 1649 reveals the disjunction between battlefield outcomes and political settlement. Charles I, refusing to accept defeat, plays a frustrating and deliberate two-level game. In May 1646, he surrenders himself to a Scottish force at Newark, calculating that Scots might offer better terms, or at least broker his staying in power by dividing his opponents. The Scots haul the king to Newcastle, where negotiations, first with Scots, then with Parliament, begin in earnest. Charles tolerates offers and then retracts, pursuing a strategy of delay and exploitation of parliamentary divisions. Parliament's victory in the field produces internal sharpening. Radicals, army officers, Presbyterians in Parliament, and Royalist moderates all contest terms. The army, unpaid and politicized, becomes a force with its own agenda. Disputes over disbandment, arrears, and settlement lead to the army's politicization and to its eventual intervention in London politics. In 1647, the army presents its own manifesto. The solemn engagement and the heads of proposals circulate as differing visions for settlement. The atmosphere is one of rising impatience. The Second Civil War of 1648 is born of this impatience and of Charles's own willingness to foment continental and Irish aid while negotiating with factions at home. Royalist risings break out in Kent, Essex, and Wales. Scottish Covenanters, having made a bargain with Charles in the so-called engagement, invade in support of the crown. These uprisings are, however, poorly coordinated and lack the strategic depth of 1644. The new model army, now thoroughly professional and politically assertive, smothers them with force. Cromwell's cavalry purification of Kent and the decisive defeats of the Scots at Preston in August 1648, under the command of Cromwell and Lambert, destroy the military hopes of the king's supporters. Politically, events accelerate beyond what many in Parliament imagine. On 6 December 1648, soldiers led by Colonel Thomas Pride enter Westminster and forcibly purge the House of Commons of those members judged unacceptable to the army, a purge later remembered as Pride's Purge. The remaining Rump Parliament, smaller and dominated by the army's allies, authorizes the trial of Charles for treason against the people of England, an extraordinary legal innovation. On 20 January 1649, the trial begins. On 27 January, the court pronounces its sentence. Charles's final words on the scaffold, recorded by multiple eyewitnesses, were framed in the vocabulary of conscience and kingship. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," he told the crowd, an assertion aimed as much at his religious conviction as at political theater. The execution of a crowned king on 30 January 1649 is unprecedented in English history. It is a political act with performative force. It annihilates the legal fiction that the king's person is inviolable and replaces monarchy with a republic, the Commonwealth. But it also deepens divisions, especially in Ireland and Scotland, where regicidal nullification of the Stuart claim will be taken as a provocation and a call to arms. Cromwell's response to the constitutionally dissipated violence is immediate and brutal, especially in Ireland. His campaign, which begins in the summer of 1649 with the landing at Dublin and culminates in a sequence of sieges and field operations, is often narrated as exemplary of both military modernity and moral hazard. Drogheda, stormed on September 3, 1649, and Wexford, sacked in October 1649, stand as the campaign's most controversial episodes. Contemporary parliamentarian accounts portrayed them as harsh but militarily necessary measures against defenders who refused quarter. Royalist and Irish narratives and later nationalist histories depict them as atrocities of near-genocidal character. Modern historians debate scale and intent. Some argue that the massacres were tactical reprisals rooted in the logistics of siege warfare and the rage inspired by years of Irish insurgency. Others insist the violence had punitive, sectarian, and dispossessing aims. Numbers vary accordingly. Eyewitnesses and propagandists inflate figures in opposite directions. Modern demographics caution that precise mortality counts for the whole of the 1640s in Ireland are elusive due to poor records, epidemics, famine, and population displacements. Estimates of excess deaths across the period, military and civilian combined, range from the low tens of thousands in some older accounts to several hundreds of thousands in revisionist interpretations that factor in depopulation and dispossession across 2 decades.
The proper historiographical posture is caution. There is incontrovertible suffering and long-term dispossession in Ireland. The scale and proximate causes are subject to continuing scholarly debate. Militarily, the Irish campaign secures strategic gains for the Commonwealth, removing the risk of a royalist foothold on Ireland to threaten England's western flank and preventing the use of Ireland as a base for Stuart restoration. Politically, however, the reconquest, conducted under Cromwellian authority, sows deep and durable resentments, precipitating land confiscations and plantation schemes that remade Irish property relations for a generation. Here again, the untold element is structural. Conquest becomes settlement, and military victory becomes socio-economic transformation. In Scotland, the regicide produces its own backlash. Many Scots, including large swaths of Presbyterian opinion, had supported Parliament in 1643 in exchange for guarantees about church settlement. But the execution of Charles alienates significant constituencies. Scottish reaction culminates in the recall of Charles's son, proclaimed Charles II by the Scots in 1649 under terms of a restored covenant. The Scots invade England in 1651 to place him on the throne, a miscalculation that brings them into collision with Cromwell's resurgent forces at Dunbar and later Worcester. Dunbar, on September 3, 1650, is a tour de force of operational surprise and maneuver. Cromwell confronts David Leslie's Scottish army, well-disciplined, tactically astute, and motivated by a distinct national religious urgency. Leslie positions his force on high ground, confident in a defensive advantage. Cromwell, recognizing that a frontal assault might be costly and that supply and morale are decisive, executes a forced march that outflanks the Scots, exploiting a lapse in their reconnaissance and a sudden change in weather that masks his approach. The battle ends in a rout. Scottish resistance collapses into retreat, and the army that had been the backbone of Covenanting power in Scotland is broken as a strategic factor.
The victory opens the route to occupation and the ultimate annexation of Scotland to Commonwealth governance. Worcester, on September 3, 1651, seals the Stuart cause's last major field attempt to regain England. Charles II, now trailing a multinational following and a desperate royalist coalition, find themselves confronted by a Cromwellian army that has learned to operate with industrial efficiency. Worcester is a bloody, chaotic campaign. Charles flees in disguise to the continent, and the royalist field threat evaporates. Militarily, the Three Kingdom Wars now end with a clear victor. The Commonwealth's armies control the principal geographic axes of Britain. Politically, the question turns to governance. The Commonwealth period, 1649-1653, is a time of intense experimentation.
The abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords creates a void that competing forces attempt to fill. The Rump Parliament, the nominated assembly, or bare-bones parliament, and the eventual instrument of government each represent attempts to craft constitutional frameworks that reconcile liberty, order, and the army's increasing power. Vests executive power in Cromwell, subject to a Council of State and triennial parliaments, and sets out procedures for military and civil administration. Its framers aim to stabilize governance without returning to the pre-war constitutional arrangement. But the Protectorate reveals the paradox of revolutionary governance. Instruments designed to constrain arbitrary power often provide new justifications for extraordinary prerogative. Cromwell's devotion to order, combined with the army's political weight and the diplomatic and military demands of the 1650s, slide the Protectorate towards centralized control. The rule of the major generals, 1655 to 1657, in which the country is divided into regions under military governors responsible for security and moral reform, manifests this trend. To some contemporaries, these governors restored civil order and suppressed banditry. To others, they embodied military dictatorship under the guise of reform. Economically, the Protectorate invests in the navy and in trade protection, actions that generate wealth for ports like London and Newcastle, but also embroil England in new foreign entanglements, including wars with the Dutch in the 1650s over sea power and commerce. Historiography has long debated the Protectorate's character. Earlier Whig accounts saw it as a necessary phase that advanced parliamentary sovereignty and laid foundations for civil liberties. Later revisionists emphasize the authoritarian aspects and cultural coercions. More recent scholarship tries to integrate both. The Protectorate is at once a period of administrative innovation, rationalized taxation, a standing navy, public registries, and of political stricture, where military necessity frequently trumped representative liberties. Cromwell's death on September 3, 1658, an irony of dates that historians note but avoid moralizing about, leaves a leadership vacuum the Commonwealth cannot fill. His son Richard lacks both the military stature and the political network to command deference. Factionalism within the army and parliament, along with economic weariness and a public longing for stability, opens the way for General George Monk's intervention. Monk, commanding forces in Scotland, advances south with a balanced calculation: restore order, call a free parliament, and negotiate a settlement acceptable to men of property and position. His march into London in 1660 precipitates the restoration. The return of Charles II in May 1660 marks another moment of constitutional recalibration. The restored monarchy reasserts many royal prerogatives, but adopts a pragmatic tolerance for parliamentary taxation and military control, shaped by the memory of the 1640s. The restoration compromises, rather than reverses, the war's institutional consequences. The standing army is now more circumscribed. The monarch must navigate an empowered commons. Nationhood is again negotiated between crown and parliament. Importantly, the South Atlantic and colonial projects begun under Stuart and Commonwealth auspices continue to expand. Empire building is accelerated in the later 17th century, a process inflected by the war's commercial and naval reorganizations. Across the three kingdoms, the human cost and social transformations are enormous and complex. In England, war produces displacement, fiscal burden, and a heightened political consciousness among a broadened public. Rural economies are disrupted by foraging, requisition, and the requirements of quartering troops. The new model army's social impact is also profound. It politicizes a generation of soldiers who, hardened and ideologically engaged, carry veterans' frameworks into post-war politics. In Scotland, the war accelerates the centralization of authority and the loss of local autonomies in some regions. It produces a mixing of political and religious motives that complicates later settlement. In Ireland, the consequences are perhaps the starkest.
land confiscations, demographic shifts, and the deepening of sectarian cleavages become structuring features of modern Irish history. The untold story here is not merely that atrocities occurred, but that military conquest became an instrument of socio-economic transformation, dispossessing communities, reallocating land to veterans and adventurers, and generating long-term grievances that outlived short-term military gains. Another untold thread is the legal and fiscal revolution. The war rewrote the grammar of revenue. The Crown's earlier recourse to ship money and forced loans had demonstrated both the limits of royal finance and the dangers of extra-parliamentary taxation. Parliament's wartime innovations, assessed contributions, excise reorganizations, and the use of county committees for taxation reconfigured the state's capacity to raise and administer funds. Moreover, the idea that legal instruments, petitions, remonstrations, and statutes could be invoked to challenge extra-legal fiscal measures became central to later constitutional debates. The Petition of Rights language, insisting on the necessity of parliamentary consent for extraordinary exactions, remained an icon of resistance to fiscal absolutism. Equally significant is the military revolution.
The new model army was not merely a temporary instrument, it embodied a modernizing logic, centralized recruitment, standardized equipment, pay structures, and a cadre of officers promoted by competence rather than merely birth. This pattern reverberated through Europe. The political consequence is paradoxical. While the army was formed to defend parliamentary sovereignty, it also created a power center able to determine political outcomes by force. The 1640s warn of what scholars still debate, whether professional armies are emancipatory institutions that protect polities or are inherently predisposed to political intervention. The personalities that populated this drama demand brief biographical attention because individual characters shaped institutional choices. Charles I was a monarch deeply persuaded by the sanctity of kingship. Devout and convinced of his office's divine sanction, he remained unwilling or unable to cede the precise powers his opponents demanded. Henrietta Maria, his French Catholic consort, functioned as both supporter and symbol, drawing sympathy among the royalist Catholic and Anglican constituencies while inflaming fears of Catholic influence in England. Prince Rupert of the Rhine combined personal gallantry with a cavalry doctrine that often decided local fights, but without logistic and infantry support could not win wars of maneuver and attrition. William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, pursued liturgical uniformity with such vigor that he provoked the cleavages that exploded in Scotland. John Pym, the Commons parliamentary organizer, mastered procedural politics and transformed scattered grievances into national platforms. Sir Edward Coke's legal memory and John Hampden's famous resistance to ship money provided legal precedents and public dramas that anchored opposition to extra-parliamentary finance. Among commanders on the parliamentary side, the Earl of Essex displayed cautious aristocratic leadership that was at times inadequate to the war's demands. Sir Thomas Fairfax, the parliamentarian general, blended stevie aristocratic authority with a soldier's pragmatism. His willingness to work with Cromwell and to back army reorganization was crucial. Oliver Cromwell stands out as the embodiment of military and ideological synthesis, a man whose fervent puritanism fused with a talent for organization and a stern intolerance of indiscipline. Figures such as the Earl of Newcastle and Montrose in the Scottish theatre offered the royalist cause strategic depth. Newcastle with political and martial control of the north, Montrose with audacious Highland campaigns allied with Irish forces under Alastair MacCulloch. On the parliamentary dissenting side, lesser-known agents, men like Ireton, Lambert, and Monk, exerted outsized influence as soldiers, administrators, and later restorers of order. Marston Moor and Naseby have already been examined as turning points, but several other campaigns merit longer tactical attention because they reveal how geography, logistics, and command shaped political outcomes. The Siege of Gloucester in 1643, for instance, was critical because its relief denied the king an early strategic prize and exposed the limits of Rupert's operational reach. The campaign in the West Country under Hopton, marked by a mixture of tactical skill and strategic overextension, illustrates how local loyalties could be mobilized but not always sustained. In Scotland, Montrose's victories in 1644-1645, especially in Verlochy and Aldern, showcase how mobile Highland warfare, allied to Irish contingents, could produce royalist surprises. Yet Montrose's gains lacked the logistic depth to sustain a national movement. Each battle, each siege, moves the strategic calculus one degree. Taken together, they convert political dispute into institutional realignment. Historiography of the Civil Wars has itself been a battleground. Early 17th and 18th century narratives tended to moralize, portraying men as heroes or villains. The 19th century Whig interpretation read the conflicts as steps towards constitutional liberty and progress.
20th-century revisionists complicated the picture, emphasizing contingent political, local, and economic interests, and questioning teleological readings of the conflict as a straightforward march toward liberalism. Military historians focused attention on tactics, command, and logistics, while social historians stressed the experience of civilians, gendered consequences, and the long-term effects on landholding and demography. Most recent scholarship tries to integrate these strands, situating the wars within a three-kingdom context, and emphasizing that England, Scotland, and Ireland cannot be properly understood in isolation. This is exactly the central claim of the untold story. The conflict's reverberations cross borders and policy domains. Primary sources demand to be heard at key moments. The Solemn League and Covenant in 1643 pledges endeavor to bring the churches of God in England into the nearest conjunction and uniformity, a phrase that reveals how religious settlement and political alliance were mutually instrumental in the war. At another moment, in the courtroom that tried him, Charles I's statement that he would go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown frames the regicide as both juridical and apologetic discourse. These texts make explicit what the battles imply. Polity and piety are entangled. Legal instruments buttress both resistance and authority. When the fighting subsides and treaties are signed or imposed, the long-term consequences become legible. Governance is altered. The notion that sovereign power can be limited by law gains traction, even if the 1650s reveal how fragile such limits may be when military authority reasserts itself.
Military institutions change. The new model army becomes a prototype for modern professional forces. Religious settlement remains unstable. Presbyterian and Anglican factions, along with various dissenting groups, continue to compete for preeminence, shaping politics for decades. Ireland's colonization and demographic reconfigurations harden into structures that will influence Anglo-Irish relations for generations, often with bitterness and memory acting as political fuel. The human ledger is complex. Towns and counties across the three kingdoms sustained damage and demographic perturbation. Some communities never recovered their pre-war population or prosperity. The war's accelerated tendencies towards centralized taxation and administrative rationalization, and increased penetration of government into local life that both modernized the state and provoked new anxieties about its reach. The colonies, too, felt the impact. Domestic turmoil in Britain altered patterns of settlement, trade, and imperial administration. If there is a single lesson threaded through the untold story, it is this: political systems create instruments, laws, taxes, armies, and those instruments, once mobilized, transform the political system in ways that are rarely anticipated. The Stuart monarchy's attempts to innovate fiscal mechanisms without political sanction, ship money, monopolies, forced loans, are not merely errors of policy. They are triggers that reveal underlying institutional fragilities. The response, petitions, covenants, armies, cannot be neatly confined. They generate consequences that spill across borders and decades. So why does the three-kingdom frame matter? Because it reveals causation that an England-only narrative obscures. Scottish religion and polity compelled English kings to confront the limits of their authority. Irish Milans supplied both casus and context for draconian measures and colonial reordering. English legal argumentation, petition of right, grand remonstrance, translated local grievance into national constitutional claims. Each theater functioned both autonomously and as part of an interconnected system. Only by tracing flows of men, money, and mercenary rhetoric across borders can one appreciate how the British world was remade. In the end, the English Civil War and the broader conflagration across Scotland and Ireland resists tidy moral categorization. There are no simple heroes or villains. Men acted out of conscience, expediency, fear, and conviction. Some used religious language to mask political calculation. Others felt genuine spiritual compulsion. Some officers pursued discipline to check savagery. Others carried out reprisals that historians still debate. What is indisputable is this: the choices made between 1637 and 1660 reshaped sovereignty, military practice, and societal structure in ways that outlived the men who fought. For the modern observer, the wars offer both caution and insight.
They show how fiscal policy and legal argument can ignite political conflagration. They demonstrate the power of alliances that cross borders and confessional lines. They reveal the ease with which military instruments can become political masters. The untold story is thus not merely a catalog of neglected battles or forgotten memoirs. It is an insistence that the shaping forces of institutional reform, cross-kingdom diplomacy, and social transformation matter as much as the scaffold and the final courtroom.
If this account has invited more questions than it has settled, that is the point. The three-kingdom conflict resists finality precisely because so many of its consequences unfold in courts, council chambers, and fields, where files of accounts and registers, ship money lists, militia rolls, petition returns still yield new clues. For the viewer who wishes to go deeper, there are layers yet to examine. The logistical registers that reveal how armies were provisioned, the probate records that show the economic ruin of particular counties, the parish returns that hint at demography's slow turn. The men on whom history weighs now live in archives. Letters from Henrietta Maria pleading for funds, dispatches from Prince Rupert that show his tactical mind and personal frustrations, John Pym's procedural notes detailing how a parliamentary majority was constructed, Cromwell's private correspondence revealing his sense of providential purpose and his political calculation. Their words instruct as much as their actions. And the maps, they insist upon attention. Watch the lines of supply from Bristol to Oxford, the river crossings that stood between armies, the mountain passes the Highlanders used to harry the lowland roads. Geography is not a backdrop, but an actor. In the final accounting, the English Civil War as three-kingdom conflict is the story of a polity in painful transition. It is the story of fiscal innovation meeting constitutional tradition, of religious reform colliding with local practice, of professional armies emerging out of local levies, of a monarch stubborn in conviction yet vulnerable in administration. The scaffolding of power changed, crowns were tested, constitutions were written and ripped, and commonwealths were tried. The human cost was enormous, the institutional aftermath, taxation, governance, military structure, colonial realignment, lasts into the modern era. If this narrative has reconstructed some of the war's less told dimensions, Scotland's political bargaining, Ireland's demographic catastrophe, the legal mechanisms that converted fiscal necessity into constitutional crisis, then it has served its purpose. The events of the 1640s and 1650s were not merely a 17th century tragedy. They were formative moments in the making of Britain and its empire.
For those who would carry the inquiry further, suggested next steps include a close reading of the Petition of Right, 1628, and the Solemn League and Covenant, 1643, a detailed archival dive into county-level muster rolls, and a cartographic tour of the principal battlefields with overlaid supply lines. Companion episodes in this series will take up individual themes in depth, a full tactical reconstruction of Naseby with orders of battle, a demographic forensic study of Ireland in the 1640s, and an institutional history of the new model army's administration. History leaves us with a final, uneasy lesson. Legal instruments can constrain power only as long as political actors accept those constraints. Armies can preserve order, yet also remake the political world. And wounds inflicted in war, material, legal, and emotional, become part of how people remember polity and identity. The untold story of the English Civil War is therefore less a single unearthing than an invitation to read the archives, to follow the maps, and to remember that the struggle for sovereignty, finance, and worship across England, Scotland, and Ireland remade a world whose aftershocks are still felt centuries later. If this examination stirred your curiosity, watch the companion deep dives on Naseby, the Irish campaigns, and the new model army's administration. Links in the description will take you there. Support for this research comes from viewers and members who value careful archival work. Consider joining to receive maps, source lists, and annotated timelines. Thank you for following this three-kingdom story. Its untold threads are, in many ways, the strands that hold modern Britain's political fabric together.